Welcome everyone. Happy to be learning with you today again. This class is a Hasid and Medival Garb, Piety and Popular Religion in Ashkenaz and Beyond with Dr. Rachel Furst. Just a quick reminder to keep yourself muted during class, and then if you want to ask questions or make comments during class, feel free to unmute yourself. With that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and welcome back to everyone who is returning. I'm going to quickly start sharing my screen so that we don't need to distract ourselves with that later. One moment. Just get that up here. Okay. And what I want to do today, as you can see up on the screen already, today's subtopic is going to be dress or clothing. But before we begin with that, I want to just briefly summarize and recap what we learned together last week, both for the benefit of those who were with us last week as a sort of as a review, and for perhaps anyone else who's joining who is not participating last week. So last week's topic was penitence or tshuva, atonement, I think was what I called the class. And we focused on the unique approach to tshuva that characterized the authors of Sefer Hasidim and other writings associated with the Hasidei Ashkenaz. And we spoke about how the most outstanding features of this approach are, number one, a focus on what we could call extreme acts of physical torture or physical flagellation that were meant to correspond to the severity of the sin that had been committed, and that the authors of Sefer Hasidim recommended as a form of atonement, a part of the process of teshuvah. And the second outstanding feature, I would say, particularly in Sefer Hasidim, is this idea that one is required to confess one's sins to a moreh, a teacher, who's occasionally called a chacham, to another human being. We also discussed how this differed from other medieval formulations of how to achieve teshuvah, including Maimonides, as well as how the attitude toward teshuvah in Sefer Hasidim compared with earlier Jewish approaches on the one hand, and with contemporaneous Christian approaches on the other. We also discussed how some of the very public and communal forms of penitence that were prescribed particularly by Sefer Hasidim, especially that idea of confessing to another person that I just mentioned, how these forms of very public and sort of communal, as I said, penitence were in a way toned down by Judah Hasid's main disciple and sort of one of the later figures associated with Hasidei Ashkenaz, that being Elazar ben Judah of Worms. We saw how in his writings, teshuvah takes on a much more personal and sort of both personally driven, I would say, and personally monitored approach to teshuvah that is prescribed in his writings, particularly when contrasted to those that we saw in Sefer Hasidim. Now, I want to add that something I mentioned perhaps a bit too quickly towards the end of the class last week is that despite their traditional association with Hasidei Ashkenaz or with Sefer Hasidim, many of these even more extreme forms of penitence, these extreme practices that we discussed last week, in particular, excessive fasting, seem to have actually found a much wider audience. That is, these extreme forms of penitential practice that we often associate with Sefer Hasidim, again, or with Hasidei Ashkenaz, were probably also adopted by many in medieval Ashkenaz who did not associate themselves or who were not associated in any way with that particular movement. And we know this because in rabbinic texts that have nothing to do with Sefer Hasidim, there are indications that these or similar practices to some of the ones that we discussed last week were in fact promoted by non-Hasidei Ashkenaz scholars, by religious leaders throughout the 13th and 14th century Ashkenaz. And again, they may have been followed by a fairly wide spectrum of the medieval Jewish population in that area. A question that we need to ask ourselves, that this leaves us with, and this is again one of the central questions that we keep returning to throughout the course, is whether this attests to the influence of Hasidei Ashkenaz, whether this demonstrates that Hasidei Ashkenaz were in fact influential beyond their immediate circles, or does this simply say that many of the pious practices that were promoted by Sefer Hasidim were in fact commonly held and commonly supported? They were not all that unique to Hasidei Ashkenaz. Now, as I said, today we're going to be moving on to a focus on dress, but just for one more moment before we do so, last week there was a question about the prevalence of sexual sin. Many of the examples that I brought last week that described the various penitential practices that Sefer Hasidim promoted had to do with sexual sin in particular. And as I mentioned last week, that's not entirely coincidental. There is a marked preoccupation with sexual sin in Sefer Hasidim, and that actually is a topic that we're going to be returning to next week. But nonetheless, I do want to reiterate that these penitential practices, these forms of extreme forms of atonement, are by no means exclusive to sexual sin. And to just demonstrate that briefly for 1 minute before we move to our new topic, I want to take a look at this passage, which is not from Sefer Hasidim itself, but it is from the Sefer Hasidim, which was one of the central works authored again by Elazar ben Judah, by the primary disciple of Yehuda Hasid. In his Hilchot Tshuva, he writes as follows: in the case of one who struck his companion, man, woman, or child, and thus took his life, the offender, right, so we're talking about a murderer here, or someone somehow involved in manslaughter, the offender should be exiled for 3 years. He should be flagellated and declare, "I am a murderer," in every city he visits. He should refrain from eating meat and drinking wine, from shaving his beard and the hair on his head, from laundering his clothes, from washing his body. Washing his beard once a month is permitted. He should attach the hand that dealt the lethal blow, to a chain looped around his neck. He should go barefoot and mourn his victim, fasting daily until his period of exile is complete. Basically fasting for 3 years is what it seems to suggest. He should then fast on Mondays and Thursdays for an additional year, even though he will have already fasted every day for 3 years. He should not do evil to any man. Should he be called a murderer, he should not argue. Rather, he should remain silent. Throughout those 3 years, he should not laugh, ever. When he leaves the synagogue each day, he should lie down before the entryway and let all who exit should step over him, never stepping on him. He should honor his wife and all persons and confess daily. Right? In a way, these penances, again, this is Sefer Hasidim, these penances seem, in a sense, even more extreme than what we saw in Sefer Hasidim, although keeping in mind here that we are talking about a murderer, so it's hard to get a sin that is more severe than murder, certainly. But in any event, the point is that, yes, these penances were prescribed for sins that had nothing to do with sexual transgression, including, again, we just saw murder, but also informing on a fellow Jew to non-Jewish authorities, desecrating Shabbat, gossiping, etc., etc. Okay, I want to now put that topic aside, although there's surely more to be said, and I want to now turn to our new topic of the day. Again, the topic of dress or of clothing. Up until now, the topics that we've been looking at, first prayer, then atonement or teshuvah, right? We said these are forms of pious practice that were particularly associated with Hasidei Ashkenaz. And we tried to understand how these practices functioned as an expression of piety for the authors of Sefer Hasidim, and again, for a wider spectrum, perhaps, of the Jewish population. Today, when we turn to talk about dress, we're going to be shifting our focus from talking about inwardly focused practices like prayer, like fasting, or other forms of penance and atonement, to thinking about the ways in which outward appearance might have conveyed piety, signaled piety, or actually been a type of pious practice for the authors of Sefer Hasidim and for other Jews in medieval Ashkenaz. Now, just as the Hasidei Ashkenaz were kind of recognized by contemporaries for some of the practices we already discussed, you may recall that when we were talking about the unique prayer practices of Hasidei Ashkenaz, I mentioned that one of the early and outstanding references, explicit references to Hasidei Ashkenaz in texts beyond Sefer Hasidim is in fact a passage in the Sefer Hatur from the middle of the 14th century that refers to the unusual prayer practices of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Well, in fact, that is the case for a dress or clothing related issue as well. And I want to take a look first at this passage from the Sefer Hashut, or the responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg was one of the outstanding halachic authorities in the second half of the 13th century in Ashkenaz. So again, Hasidei Ashkenaz, that movement was a 12th and 13th century, again, to whatever extent it was a movement, but certainly Sefer Hasidim was written at the end of the 12th and perhaps into the beginning of the 13th century. And Meir of Rothenburg was probably living something like half a century after Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. In one of his responsa, that is in fact not his own responsum, but as you can see if you just glance down at the end of this paragraph, it's a responsum that was offered by Shimshon ben Rabbi Avraham, or Shimshon of Shantz, as he is occasionally known. He was in fact a contemporary of Yehuda HaChasid. So even though this text itself is from half a century later, the responsa, the particular question and answer that are embedded within it are from somewhere contemporaneous to Sefer Hasidim itself. And Rabbi Shimshon ben Avraham, who was asked a question about having to do with tzitzit and what different garments could tzitzit be attached to, wrote, "And I have heard that the talitot made like the chaperons, I don't even know how to pronounce that exactly, I apologize, are like the talitot of Hasidei Ashkenaz." Right, so he's referring to a specific type of garment that was referred to, that was used as a talit in medieval Ashkenaz, which was known as the type of talit that Hasidei Ashkenaz used to use. What kind of talit is this? Well, it has 4 corners, and when it's removed, one folds it and then wraps oneself in it. Right, so it's a little bit difficult to precisely envision what he's talking about, but scholars believe he's talking about something that is akin to what we would today call a talit katan, a sort of a 4-cornered garment that one could wear underneath one's clothing or on top of one's clothing, but that was designed specifically for the purpose of attaching the ritual fringes to its corners, right? As contrasted with a talit gadol, or the type of talit that we today associate with use during prayer. Now, he said that kind of talit katan that you could wear all day whose real function was to enable the wearer to wear tzitziot, that kind of talit, there are those who say, I'm reading now in the fourth line, that that garment is not a proper talit, unless it's like ours, that is made not to wear, but solely to be wrapped in and covered with, as it is written, your mantle and garment. On this talit, one says the blessing. And he goes on. The point being that there's some kind of dispute, contemporaneous dispute, concerning which garments were particularly appropriate for wearing tzitzit with, but the Hasidei Ashkenaz were associated with one of these garments. Now, the reason that this is worth pointing out, aside from the fact that it constitutes some, again, external to Sefer Hasidim evidence that there were people known as Hasidei Ashkenaz. Again, that's a question that we continually ask ourselves throughout this class. But this seems to be evidence that there were at least some people who were recognized by their contemporaries as part of this group known as Hasidei Ashkenaz. But another important point that this passage makes is that Hasidei Ashkenaz were associated specifically with the wearing of talitot, or the wearing of tzitziot, right? These were the talit katan and the tzitziot that were attached, the ritual fringes that were attached to it. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why were Hasidei Ashkenaz specifically singled out and recognized for the wearing of a talit katan? Is that not simply a standard garment that religious men wear? And in fact, the answer is that in medieval Ashkenaz, in at least 12th and 13th century Ashkenaz, it does not seem to have been widely practiced. That is, most men in medieval Ashkenaz do not seem to have regularly worn tzitziot. And by the way, that holds true for tefillin as well. Now, this may be a little bit surprising to those of us who associate these practices as fairly standard practices, daily practices of religious, at least men. It might be surprising to hear that this community, which was so strongly associated with piety, with religious fealty, with religious practice, with regular religious practice, that it was not common for men to actually be wearing tzitzit and tefillin, as I said, in this community. But in fact, we have fairly solid evidence that that was the case, and that this lack of wearing tzitziot and talitot is in fact something that goes back probably to the Gaonic period, to the very early medieval period. We don't know exactly why this was the case. It's possible that people were overly concerned with their ability to maintain bodily purity, which is required by the halakhah, in particular when one wears tefillin, but also tzitziot. Could be, some scholars suggest that people were under the misimpression that wearing talitot with tzitzit and or tefillin were practices that were incumbent only on people who were actually learning Torah, or perhaps were only incumbent on Talmidei Chachamim. It's possible that people were simply lax in their observance of this particular mitzvah for reasons that we can't exactly discern. It's interesting that, again, I said this laxity seems to date back to the Geonim. When one looks at the writing of Rav Shura Geon, for example, he suggests that, in fact, some people thought that those who actually did wear tzitzit and tefillin were not being pious, but being more sort of overly righteous or even immodest, flaunting their religiosity by wearing these things. And it's interesting, therefore, in that light, that the authors of Sefer Hasidim seem to have very strongly encouraged the wearing of tzitzit, and again, tefillin as well, but we're going to be focusing on the tzitzit. Let's take a look at some of the passages where that comes to the fore. So here you have a passage from Sefer Hasidim, that talks about one man who wanted to wrap himself in tzitzit. Again, it's not 100% clear here whether we're talking about a talit katan or a talit gadol. It doesn't matter that much. They said to him, wait until the Shabbat to begin. He said, with any other garment, I would postpone it until the Shabbat, but I will not postpone talit and tzitzit. Rather, even on a weekday, I will wrap myself for the sake of the commandments. As it says in scripture, I have hurried and not delayed in keeping your commandments. Now, I want to point out here, by the way, in case for those of you who may be a little distracted by the illustration, this is an illustration that, as you can see, is taken from the Leipzig Machzor, which was in fact written and illustrated in Worms in Germany, sometime around the year 1310, so really the turn of the 14th century. We saw this image briefly a couple of weeks ago, but now I want to point out who here is wearing a talit or tzitzit.
Just the reader.
Oh yeah, only the chazan, right? The reader or the prayer leader, right? The one who's looking at the book. He's the only one here who's wearing tzitzit, at least in any visible way, right? The two men behind him, they're wearing cloaks, but they don't seem to be wearing talitot. And in fact, scholars, art historians suggest that this is kind of typical of, and reflect something real, something accurate about the situation in medieval Ashkenaz, where the wearing of tzitzit, the wearing of a talit gadol, the wearing of a prayer shawl, was not a very widespread practice at this time, certainly not something that the average standard member of the congregation would have engaged in, right? It was something that here, again, the chazan, the one who's actually leading the congregation, is wrapped up in a big talit, but the other men are not. And that, again, is probably not coincidental. That is attested to not only in this machzor, but in various other pictorial representations, as well as, again, as I was saying, in various other written text. But going back to the text from Sefer Hasidim that we have in front of us here, right, the point is that the author of Sefer Hasidim seems to be really promoting the wearing of talit and tzitzit. This is a mitzvah that is particularly important to adopt, so much so that we really encourage people to begin really as soon as they're inspired right away. To make this come across a bit even more strongly, if you look at this next passage from Sefer Hasidim, the author here writes, any commandment that can be done in private should be done that way. But in order to teach others on the basis of his deeds, he should carry out commandments such as talit and tefillin in public, lest people say this or that commandment need not be performed. Therefore, he should do them in public. And even if people mock him, he should perform them publicly, for ultimately he will receive a reward for the shame and the sorrow. Now, this theme of the Hasid, first of all, acting in ways that bring shame and scorn upon him, right? That's a theme that we've already seen and will continue to see. That is a common trope in Sefer Hasidim, this idea that one of the marks of the Hasid is being willing to act in ways that might make other people mock him. But it's, I think, for our purposes, significant here that the specific act that's being singled out, the specific act that's being highlighted as one which may bring upon him scorn or shame, is in fact the public wearing of talit and tefillin, which the author is very much encouraging, despite the shame and scorn that it might elicit. And again, the author is recognizing that in principle, one could perform these mitzvot without any sort of public display. These are not mitzvot that require a public in order to perform them, right? They don't require a minyan. You don't have to put on tefillin or tzitziot specifically in public, but nonetheless, the author is encouraging the Hasid to do so as a means of really encouraging and stimulating other people to perform these acts as well, which first of all, I think strengthens the suggestion that these were not widespread practices, religious practices at the time. So again, here we're talking about Sefer Hasidim, we're talking about probably the late 12th, early 13th century. So it seems to confirm that, that suggestion. But also it seems to, again, really encourage the Hasid to be a public face for promoting that practice. Now, this idea that the public wearing of tefillin and tzitzit might in fact be scorned, perhaps because it was not a widely accepted practice. And here again, I don't think the suggestion is that it's going to be scorned by people outside of the community who maybe don't know what these articles are, right? And just think it kind of looks weird for somebody to be wearing, a black box on his head, or for somebody to be wrapped up in this, thing with dangling tzitziot. I think the suggestion is that other Jews, other members of the Jewish community are going to be directing scorn at the Hasid for wearing these articles, again, probably because it was not mainstream practice. Taking that one step further, in this next passage that you can see, Sefer Hasidim goes so far as to compare the shame that might the public performance of these rites might elicit with, in fact, an act of martyrdom. Right, let's take a look at that. Sefer Tehillim says, "It is for your sake that we are slain all day long." Right, this is a passage from Sefer Tehillim that is frequently associated with martyrdom as an ideal. There are people who are subject to embarrassment, shame, and humiliation for observing the commandments. But here the author of Sefer Hasidim is suggesting that the slain of Tehillim is not a reference to actual death for the sake of God, but rather subjecting oneself to embarrassment and shame, right? We know that Hamal binet pnei chavero berabim, ki'ilu shafach damim, one who embarrasses his fellow in public, it is as though he has killed that person, right? So there's already in the Talmud many associations of extreme shame with a form of death, a form of murder. And that's, I think the author is playing with that a little bit over here. Sefer Hasidim says, when one comes forward to perform the commandments of tzitzit, tefillin, and others, his blood is then spilled, ki'ilu, right, as though spilled, while being shamed, or he is humiliated as if his blood had been spilled. This type of ridicule prevents them from fulfilling the commandment, right? Most people, right, are prevented by this type of ridicule from fulfilling the commandment, but the Hasid here, again, is being enjoined to embrace the public performance of these commandments precisely because it is going to bring upon him the shame and scorn, right? Just as a pious person is enjoined to embrace martyrdom when the moment necessitates it, right? So too is the Hasid here being enjoined to embrace these publicly embarrassing performances of, again, specifically wearing tzitzit and tefillin, despite the fact, again, that it is going to metaphorically kill him by bringing this intense shame upon him. But that is what a Hasid does. That is what a Hasid is willing to do as an expression of his love for, of his devotion to God. Now, the emphasis on these practices by the authors of Sefer Hasidim does seem to be very marked, very outstanding, right? These are just a handful of passages, the ones that I've brought for you throughout the book that really encourage the Hasid to wear these clothing that will definitively mark them as different, will mark them, again, positively or seemingly, sometimes negatively, as being members of this overly pious group, but they're nonetheless being encouraged to do that as a form of piety in and of itself. But even though this is so distinctive to Sefer Hasidim, it seems that Sefer Hasidim was in the vanguard of a trend that was much more widespread than simply the Hasidei Ashkenaz movement. What do I mean by this? It seems that over the course of the 13th century, there seems to have been a much more widespread adoption or readoption, perhaps, of these mitzvot that had been really neglected in earlier medieval Ashkenaz. One of the rabbinic authors that is associated with this is in fact Moses of Kuchi, the author of the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, or the Smag, who was himself also a student of Yehuda Hasid, but who is known not so much for his association with the Hasidei Ashkenaz movement as he is for his preaching. He took on these missions to go out and to really shore up the masses, to encourage people to embrace religious practice. Specifically, he traveled from Ashkenaz to Spain and to Provence, which he had marked as areas that were, to his mind, rather lax in their observance of various commandments. But scholars suggest that he also adopted many of these, that he went around preaching many of these messages in Ashkenaz, that is in Germany and in northern France as well. And one of the campaigns that he undertook was a campaign to promote the wearing of tzitzit and tefillin. That's one of the specific practices that he singles out in his writing as something that he was really encouraging all of his listeners to perform. But even beyond, and again, you could say that Moshe of Kuchi is specifically, again, even if he wasn't a Hasid Ashkenaz himself, he is somewhat affiliated with some of the leaders of that circle. But in fact, we see throughout the rabbinic writing in, again, the 13th century and into the 14th century, increasing halachic discussion of these mitzvot, and whether that's including whether tzitzit, for example, could or should be tied on garments that don't actually require them, right? Technically, according to the Torah, the only garments that require tzitzit are garments that are actually four-cornered. And if you happen to be wearing a four-cornered garment, then you are obligated to wear tzitzit, but you're not, according to the Torah, obligated to go out of your way to wear a four-cornered garment or to attach the tzitzit to garments that are not literally four-cornered. So there's all kinds of questions, increasing numbers of halachic questions about the types of garments to which tzitzit should be attached, whether the dead should be buried in a talit with tzitzit. Which incidentally, when that question came up in the 12th century, scholars suggested that the dead should not be buried in talitot because it might in fact embarrass them, since it was not a practice that they had observed in their own life. And again, that was on the assumption that in the 12th century and earlier medieval times, most people, most average men, did not wear talitot or tzitzit on a regular basis. But when these questions begin to get asked again in the later 13th and into the 14th century, the tone of the answers shifts. And in fact, it became standard practice to bury the dead in talitot with tzitzit, and also to allow attendees at a funeral to wear talitot with tzitzit, which again in earlier times was rejected, once more, lest it embarrass the dead who had not in fact fulfilled that precept in his own life. But over the course of the 13th and into the 14th century and beyond, the assumption seems to be that most men did follow that practice. And so it wouldn't be an embarrassment to the dead if other people were to be doing that at their funerals. Again, all of these things really only make sense if we assume that tzitzit and tefillin, really tzitzit and talitot, tefillin became much more widespread practices. And some art historians, including Katrin Kojman-Appel, who's a professor, she was a professor in Israel, is now a professor in Germany, who has studied in particular the Haggadah that this image that you see that we took a look at is taken from. She suggests that although not here, it is the case that over the course of the 14th century, Jewish men come to be pictorially represented in a very wide spectrum of texts as wearing tzitzit talitot. In other words, that comes to be associated, it comes to be used as a symbol for the Jewish male, as a way of marking Jewish men pictorially in representations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, which also suggests that the widespread adoption of this practice was something that really happened over the course of time that we're talking about. And so once again, this leaves us asking, well, do we see here evidence of influence of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, or at least of the authors of Sefer Hasidim, who really bent over backwards to encourage this practice, the influence that they had on a wide swath of the medieval Jewish population? Or again, are we talking about something that was a trend that was just much bigger than the authors of Sefer Hasidim, although the authors of Sefer Hasidim certainly participated in that and were maybe one of the earlier, it's, as I said, sort of in the vanguard of that movement. Yes, Naomi, I see that you have a question, please.
Yes. What about the distinctive hats?
Okay.
Picture.
Thank you for asking that, because that is the next topic that I wanted to address briefly here. You will notice in this image that we have in front of us over here that not the prayer leader, right? Because the prayer leader is in fact wrapped in the talit. The talit is over his head, so his head covering is the talit. But you will notice that there are the two other men who are standing behind him are marked in another way. They're wearing these very strange hats, which in fact recur. They are very, very frequent in medieval depictions of Jewish men, particularly from the 13th, 14th century and beyond, particularly from the German Empire, from the German lands. This hat is known as the Judenhut, the Jewish hat. And there's actually been a fair amount of debate about this hat, because there is evidence from later times that this hat was, in fact, it was required for Jewish men to wear, required by, that is, non-Jewish, by the local Christian authorities, as a means of marking them as Jews, right? Much in the way that in later medieval times, Jewish men and women were, at least officially, obligated to wear badges on their clothing that marked them as Jews, right? And by the way, one of the earliest times that this Jewish badge, which often took the form of a yellow circle, one of the earliest times that we hear about it is in the edicts that were issued by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1240, where it is explicitly stated that the goal of marking Jews in these ways was to make sure that there wasn't inappropriate and unacceptable mingling, social mingling, between Jews and Christians. Now, we're going to come back to that point afterwards, because what it sort of suggests is that it was necessary to mark Jews in these distinguishing ways, because without these badges, or without these, again, hats that were presumably instituted, required in later times, it wouldn't have been so easy for the average person to know who was a Jew and who was a Christian. Right, so that's
sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Here they're wearing in presumably a Jewish location.
Yes. So I want to follow that up. Yes, thank you. So again, that's a point that I want to, the question of, again, what this all suggests about the ability of the average person to, without these symbols, without these signs, identify Jews. That's one point that I want to make, but I want to leave that question on the side. You are correct to point out that here, and again, this machzor, this Leipzig machzor, is in no way unique in this regard. In Jewish art, right, or I should say in art that appears in Jewish texts, so many machzorim, as well as various prayer books, Haggadot, and Ktubot, and other forms of Jewish art, it is very common from a particular point from around the 13th century to see Jewish men depicted wearing this funny kind of Judenhut. And there's a lot of debate among scholars as to whether this was in fact adopted by Jews voluntarily before it became instituted in any kinds of way. But certainly the fact that these images appear in, again, Jewish art suggests that it wasn't necessarily seen, the hat in particular I'm talking about, as a negative thing, right? As something pejorative, as something that marked them in a bad way. Now, a related question that scholars ask is whether Jewish men were in fact always covering their heads, right? Because the fact that Jewish men are depicted in art in this way, right, it marks them as Jewish by virtue of the fact that it's this strange kind of hat. But does it mark them as Jewish because it's a strange kind of hat, or does it mark them as Jewish because their heads are covered? Right? These are also questions that scholars ask themselves. And it's not entirely clear. And here I want to reiterate what, kind of follow up on what I said beforehand about the tzitzit and the tefillin. At this period in time, that is 12th, 13th century, roughly contemporaneous to Sefer Hasidim, the writing of Sefer Hasidim, it is not at all clear that all Jewish men covered their heads all the time. Nor, I want to add, is it clear that Jewish men always wore beards, which you can see at least one of the men in this image very distinctively sporting a beard, that the man in the middle, right? Right. That's also something that later came to be associated with a marker of Jewishness, or at least of Jewish masculinity. But it is not at all clear that at this point in time, that was a standard practice. I want to move on that note. We can come back to that image afterwards if you have more questions about that. But I want to, continuing on that line of thought, I want to take a look at this next passage that you can see from Sefer Hasidim, which relates to that question of facial hair, or of hairstyles, facial and hair on the head, hairstyles, and the way in which they were associated with Jewish practice and with pious practice in particular. The author of Sefer Hasidim does at several junctures seem to really encourage not shaving facial hair, seems to really encourage men to be wearing beards. Right, and in this particular passage, this passage is talking about the way in which people might have achieved a clean-shaven look. The author of Sefer Hasidim here writes, "Behold, every permitted thing," it's in the context of talking about how permitted, just more broadly, how permitted things that lead one to violate a prohibition, right? If there's something permitted that leads you to violate a prohibition, it's better to prohibit the permitted in order that one not come to violate the prohibited. Right? So for example, in a land where people regularly shave their beards with scissors, which is permitted, right? The problem really is shaving a beard with a razor. That's the way that medieval scholars at least understood the injunction in the Torah. In a land where people regularly shave their beards with scissors, but because, again, then everybody's sort of walking around barefaced, some shave as though with a razor and some actually shave with a razor. So one should prohibit doing with scissors so that they don't come to do a sin. Right, so now here the author of Sefer Hasidim really seems to be focus in particular on the means of achieving this barefaced look. But again, the idea is that the author of Sefer Hasidim, the idea that I would like to convey is that the author of Sefer Hasidim seems much in the way that the authors of Sefer Hasidim really promoted talit and tefillin, even though that seems to have not been a widespread practice. The authors of Sefer Hasidim really promoted men wearing beards, although evidence suggests that in the 12th and 13th century, Jewish men were not generally bearded. Many of them, in fact, many rabbinic texts make it very clear that most Jewish men went around shaved, went around barefaced. Again, this is a little bit surprising insofar as so many of the pictorial representations that we have, certainly from later periods, do depict Jewish men with beards, but that also seems to have been something that was really shifting around this point in time. By the way, just completely in parentheses, I want to note that the fact that Jewish men in Europe, in Ashkenaz, or in Europe at large, seem to have mostly been shaven, that is in fact distinctive to European Jews. It's very clear that at this point in time, most Jewish men in Muslim lands were in fact bearded, but surprise, surprise, so were most Muslim men, right? And we know for a fact that in Christian Europe, right, most men were not bearded, right? So should not be so surprising, right, that most Jewish men at this time in Europe followed, sort of the trend of their environment, much as most Jewish men in Muslim lands followed the trend in their environment as well. But once again, the author of Sefer Hasidim seems to really promote the wearing of a beard. And this is something that, although it is unique to the author of Sefer Hasidim, seems to have been, again, promoted beyond Sefer Hasidim as well, right? It seems that around this time, in a broader sense and across a spectrum of the Jewish Ashkenazi population, it became rabbinic authors more and more, and communal leaders at large seemed to really begin encouraging Jewish men to wear beards. And just as an example of this, the text that you see in front of you is from Takanot Shum, or the ordinances of the communities of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, of the famous Rhineland communities, which, again, we don't know exactly when this text is from, but sometime in the 13th century, they instituted as a communal ordinance that no one shall cut his hair in a non-Jewish fashion or shave his beard either with a razor, which is explicitly forbidden in the Torah, or in such a manner as approximates the effects of a razor. Nor shall one wear long hair. Right, and these two, by the way, cutting your hair in a sort of like shaving around the head, the sort of haircut that was associated with magicians, among other people, and wearing long hair, those were hairstyles that were explicitly associated with Christians, and that's what's being really outlawed or campaigned against in this particular ordinance. And if you take a look, by the way, at the image that you have here, for those of you who are curious, this is the very famous bird's head Haggadah, as it's known. It was written and illustrated in Germany also around the year 1300, so roughly around the same time as that Leipzig Machzor that we saw before. Again, all of these characters have unusual faces, these sort of bird-like or griffin-like faces. We won't go into the question of that. It's a fascinating topic for a different discussion. You will note, of course, that 3 out of the 4 men here are wearing the Judenhut, this distinctive Jewish hat, right? The one who is not, the 2 women, by the way, are the ones who are wearing the red snoods, right? Those are the 2 women in this picture. They're in the midst of baking matzot. This should be obvious. You'll notice that there's one character who is not wearing a snood. It's not a woman, nor does that character is not wearing a hat, nor does that character have a beard. The other men are both bearded and hat wearing. And the suggestion is that that is a young man, hence no beard, who wasn't wearing a hat. And it's interesting, if you look throughout this bird's head Haggadah, there are a number of characters who are male, clearly male characters who are not hat wearing. Most of them, though, and not bearded, excuse me, most of them, though, are either explicitly not Jewish, as in, again, this is a Haggadah, Paro and the Egyptians, they don't wear hats and don't wear beards. Angels don't wear hats and don't wear beards. And various other individuals who seem to have been at the sort of edges, not full-fledged members of the Jewish community, such as young men. It's interesting to think about that. Yes, please.
So, are you? Is everybody agree that that middle person making the matzah is definitely not a woman?
Yeah. Everyone seems to be agreed that that person is not a woman. And I would add to that hair covering for women is basically always depicted. As here, these women who are wearing suits. Yes, it's pretty much
And for a young
well, so that's a good question. Maybe not for the younger women, certainly for the married women. But it does seem to be universally agreed that that is a male character. Having to do with the way with his hairstyle, having to do with his form of dress. Everyone seems to be agreed that that's a male character, but a bareheaded and beardless male character.
I'm just nitpicking because
Yeah,
the women were the ones who generally were the ones who like kneaded the dough and punched out the matzah. And then the men were the one who shoved it into the oven.
well, you can see, right, and you can see that in the picture here, but you can also see there's also an adult man who's also, holding the hole maker, right? Who seems also to be engaged in the process of at least making the holes in the matzah, right? In this depiction. Yeah. Anyway, Naomi, I see that you have another question.
Yeah, I was going to ask it, but you kind of brought it up by saying the women were wearing snoods, and I was going to say, were there dress norms for women?
Yes. Okay. Okay.
What were
Thank
they?
you for asking that question, because that's going to use us in the last few minutes that we have here. I would like certainly to address that question. Just before we go there, so thanks for steering me in that direction. Before we go there, I just do want to very, very quickly point to this source that we're not going to be able to do justice to in any way. But this is a text just to kind of solidify the point that I've been making about Yehuda Hasid and the Hasidei Ashkenaz attitude toward beards as distinctive markers of Jewishness or of piety, Jewish piousness. This is a passage not from Sefer Hasidim, but from Sefer Hagan, which was a text authored by, again, Yehuda Hasid's main disciple, Elazar of Worms. In this particular text, he credits the following story to the son of Yehuda Hasid. Zalman was his name. The son of Yehuda Hasid told him the following story. Now, again, this text is not Sefer Hasidim itself, but it's close. It's in a part of a close enough circle that I think it is significant. Once there was a rich man in Speyer who would cut his beard with scissors, right? So he's doing it in the permitted way, right? Scissors are okay. It's the razor that's forbidden according to the Torah. So he would cut his beard with scissors, which again seems to have been fairly widespread Jewish practice, Jewish male practice at the time. My father, Yehuda Hasid, came to rebuke him, but the rich man did not heed his scolding. Rather, he said, I'm an istinus. Istinus is in Talmudic terminology, one who is kind of finicky. Has particular hygienic concerns, and I cannot stand having a beard. My father said, you should know that your fate will be dire. After your death, demons that resemble cows, and this is a play, parot is the Hebrew, will stamp on your beard. This is the lot of one who destroy beards. You should know this, for it is written in scripture, you shall not destroy the side growth of your beards. And if you look at the Hebrew, lo takfu peat roshechem velo tashchitu, right? Roshei tevot, if you take the opening letters, it's an acronym basically for parot, cows, right? And that's why cows are going to come and stamp on his beard, because he cut it off. When that rich man died, the prominent people of Speyer were all sitting Shiva in his home. My father was there too. meaning Yehuda Hasid. He wrote a name and flung it on the corpse of the rich man, who then stood up. Everyone else ran away. The corpse began to pick at his head and tear his hair. My father asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I regret not having listened to you." Apparently the cows, these demonic cows did show up. Anyway, as I said, we do not have time to do any sort of justice to the story. There's much that can be done with it. There's much that scholars have done with this story. But for our purposes, right, if nothing else, it should certainly, kind of make a mark in your minds as to Yehuda Hasid and, again, the Hasidei Ashkenaz Sefer Hasidim's attitude toward beard wearing. This is a pious practice that they very strongly encouraged. Okay, now again, the question was about women and women's clothing, a very worthy question. As I said, we are going to devote an entire week to talking about the attitude of Sefer Hasidim to women and gender in, I think, 2 weeks' time, but certainly worthy of discussion today, at least briefly as well. This passage over here, right, addresses the question of cross-dressing, right, of men wearing women's clothing, women wearing, or specifically women wearing men's clothing, which, as we know, was a biblical prohibition that certainly the authors of Sefer Hasidim took seriously. Nonetheless, they write as follows: even though the Torah said a woman must not put on man's apparel, nor should a man wear women's clothing, if enemies besiege the city, or if they're traveling on the road, and if the enemies know that they're women, they will rape them, which was not uncommon in medieval times. Just in general, as the traveling was a very dangerous proposition. Then they should travel in men's clothing, and even with a sword, so that they, meaning the enemies, will think that they are men. Sefer Hasidim goes on to say there was an incident with a very pretty woman who was traveling on the road with her husband, and she made herself a beard. Right, talk about again beards and the beard wearing here. It's a woman who's wearing the beard from the hair of her friend. She made this, sort of false beard. And she put it on her face so that anyone who saw her thought that she was a man, and she was saved. And this is like the boys who don't yet have a beard, and they wear women's clothing to be saved, or Christian clothing to deceive the enemies. Right. So the author of Sefer Hasidim is condoning, or maybe even promoting, these various forms of cross-dressing that strictly halakhically speaking, are problematic if it functions as a means of protecting people from these very real dangers of, again, for the women being raped, for the men, these young boys, of being attacked or maybe raped as well, then it is promoting this idea that people are allowed to, again, disguise themselves as a means of saving themselves. Now, this raises all kinds of questions that I'm just going to be able to touch upon briefly today, but perhaps we'll return to, of, well, again, and going back to questions that we asked ourselves beforehand, that I raised beforehand, right? What does this suggest about the way in which people's clothing or people's external appearance was distinctive to begin with? Right? What does that mean to wear Christian clothing? Yeah. Now, this theme gets picked up several times in Sefer Hasidim, as in the following very famous passage about a woman. If a woman is walking on the road and she hears that she might encounter Gentiles and is worried that they might rape her, again, same theme as we saw in the previous passage, then she should disguise herself. Here the suggestion is not to wear this beard to disguise herself as a man, but perhaps she should disguise herself as a female religious woman, meaning a Christian religious woman. The Hebrew word that is used here is komeret, which sounds literally like a priestess. It's not exactly clear who Sefer Hasidim is referring to. The point being, right, so that they won't rape her. And similarly, if she heard that Jewish thugs might harm her, right, it doesn't only have to be fear of these, Christian people on the road, but if she's afraid of Jewish criminals, then too she may dress like a Gentile woman, threaten to betray them, and cry for help before they, meaning the Jewish thugs, attack. All of these actions are permitted so that the Gentiles will help her, even if they kill the Jewish thugs. Right? So here Sefer Hasidim is, very aware of the fact that these actions, first of all, they're problematic, potentially or theoretically problematic, insofar as, again, she's putting on the dress of a person of a different religion. This is, certainly in many ways of the reviled religion. But also in some cases, this is actually putting other Jews, now mind you, Jewish criminals, right? But it's putting other Jews in danger, these actions. And nonetheless, the author of Sefer Hasidim here is very clear about the fact that her responsibility is to herself, is to take care to protect herself from the threat of rape and from other threats. Again, be they from Christians, threats from Christians, or threats from other Jews. I just put this image over here, which is, as you can see, from a Christian text from also Germany in the 13th century that depicts three nuns. Those are three nuns, doesn't really matter the context right now, but those are three nuns. Just to really raise this question for us is, what is Christian dress? What does it mean that these women, these Jewish women, were disguising themselves, or were being encouraged to disguise themselves as Christian religious women, right? As a means of trying to protect themselves from while traveling on the road, right? In this particular picture, okay, we can see that they're wearing, these habits of some sort, right? They're wearing long robes. We would have to look at many images of Jewish women. Again, these are all pictorial descriptions. Obviously, they're not photographs or anything like that. But the question really remains, what does that mean to disguise themselves as religious women? What it certainly suggests is that Jews of the time, or at least the audience of Sefer Hasidim, was very well attuned to what different people in their environment were wearing, right? They knew what it meant to look like a Christian religious woman. They knew what people, the different ways in which people used clothing to mark themselves religiously, to mark themselves, you could say, piously, right? And that's actually a question for us to keep in mind as we ask about the ways in which Sefer Hasidim or other Jews of the time used clothing as an expression of piety. Other people around them were doing the same thing, right? Other people being other Jews or other Christians, clothing was used in a way of marking piety. Now, I'm going to conclude for today, and I know I apologize that we're a minute or so over, but I'm going to conclude. I want to conclude with this one last passage, also from Sefer Hasidim, that puts a little bit of a damper on what we just saw, right? Here, Sefer Hasidim says, right, and this is in accordance with the verse from Isaiah, all who see them shall recognize that they are a stock that the Lord has blessed, right? People are supposed to recognize Jews as such, or Israelites as members of the tribe. How so? Israel, meaning a Jew, should say, even if soldiers come, they, i.e. the Jews, should not stitch crosses on their clothes, nor make themselves look like priests, nor place crosses in their home, nor have their heads in the manner of the priests and monks, so that non-Jews might think that they're not Jewish. And if the non-Jews come through the area to hurt Jews, and the non-Jews go to a house of idol worship, the Jews should not join them, so that they will think that they too are Gentiles. For it says in scripture, if we forget the name of God and spread forth our hands to a foreign God, etc., right, that is not permissible. Now, I just want to ask you as a parting question, and we don't even need to answer this right now. Perhaps we'll let it linger, and we can pick up with this at the beginning of class next week. What's the difference between these two passages? Or three passages, I should say, right? The previous two that we saw seem to be pretty clear about the fact that if it's going to save someone from danger, people are allowed to transgress certain clothing-related violations. They're allowed to cross-dress, men as women, women as men. They're allowed to, the women are allowed to, or even encouraged to make themselves look like these religious women, Christian religious women, excuse me, as a means of protecting themselves. But here, Sefer Hasidim seems to be adopting a completely different tact, right? There's yesh gvul, there's a limit here, right? You're not allowed to put crosses on your clothes or make yourself look like a priest, put a cross on your home, go into a house of worship, right? There's a limit to what you're supposed to do. So where does that limit lie? Where is the boundary? And why does the author, again, authors of Sefer Hasidim, what is the distinction that they're making here? Now, again, we could easily resolve this by saying there are different authors and these are different tactics, but I want to suggest that perhaps there is a difference here between the passage that we saw previously and this one. And again, I apologize, I know time is up, I will, as I said, leave that for you as food for thought, and we'll pick up with that next week and try to wrap together this theme.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Just one quick announcement that on this Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will have a special class for Purim with Rabbi David Silber and Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens, discussing the question of what it means to live in a world with an invisible God. So I hope to see you there and hope to see you at all of our other classes. To register for the Purim class for this Sunday, you can go on purim.risha.org. Thank you so much again, and lehitraot. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.